While prejudice is a belief system, discrimination is an actual action or behavior. There are 5 types of discriminatory behaviors. Antilocution, which is verbal rejection, and that would be the use of epithets and racial slurs to put people down or telling jokes that put others down. Avoidance, the refusal to interact with people from diverse groups and backgrounds based on their group membership. Active discrimination, the purposeful exclusion of members of other groups from employment, education, politics, housing, and so forth. Physical attacks, the use or threat of violence to intimidate members of groups, attacks on property of group members, and extermination, the participation of an individual or a group in activities that lead to the death of another, such as lynchings, genocides, or massacres. Sometimes when we talk about discrimination, the word will have a suffix of ism. Racism, sexism, classism are words you're probably familiar with. It's an action where the person is discriminating against the class of that person. Something falls into the category of an ism, i.e. sexism or racism, when that practice is institutionalized and supports the dominant class's privilege. That type of action is reinforcing the social hierarchy. So if a person who is in the subordinate class, such as the women making a joke about men, that would not necessarily be categorized as an ism. Then there is also the idea of the micro-discrimination that is happening at the individual level and not on the broader societal level. So a micro-discrimination is the specific thing or behavior that the individual engages in. Macro-discriminations, on the other hand, looks at how discrimination is built into the fabric of society. Macro-discrimination occurs through specific social institutions. For instance, education, such as the racial segregation that occurred in the 1950s, or employment, such as the use of networking to gain employment opportunities. The individual does not actually have to be conscious of being discriminatory because the social institution has patterns and practices that may be unexamined and unchallenged that lead to discriminatory outcomes. A good example of that is lending redlining, where banks have higher lending rates in areas that may have minorities living in those neighborhoods. So we can say that oftentimes discrimination is embedded in our social institutions. The roots of institutional discrimination in the United States can be traced back to the early English settlers. These colonists established the socio-cultural structures that forced other groups to assimilate into their ethnocentric ways of life. Even though many ethnicities and races emigrated later, those of English or Anglo-Saxon ancestry held many of the power positions that determined the institutional and cultural practices that came to define the United States. Thus, the U.S. is deeply rooted in Anglo-Saxon culture. And when I refer to Anglo-Saxon, I'm talking about the Germanic people that settled in England in the 5th century. When other groups immigrated to the U.S., such as the Irish or the Chinese, they were pressured to adapt to U.S. culture, which was all rooted in Anglo-Saxon heritage. Part of this culture was Protestantism, known for its focus on the Protestant work ethic, as well as religious and moral roots within that religion. Also, many of the laws of the New World were based on English common law, which created a framework for our own legal system and the underpinning for many basic social policies. While we think of the Declaration of Independence as a document that assures the equality of all people, it was drafted to support the dominant class. In 1776, the phrase, "all men," applied only to wealthy, property-owning white males, Women were excluded. Poor whites and people of color were not part of this group, which the Declaration of Independence was referring to. One institution that has a main impact on people's life chances is the social institution of the economy. It's important to understand that the English colonized North America because it was economically advantageous to do so. The English wanted to increase their wealth through additional landholdings and increase commerce from the New World. Economic growth and wealth depended on the ownership of private property, markets, and contracts. This was the basis for our current economic system. Even after the American Revolution, this basic economic structure continued. Slavery became a part of the Southern economic system because it provided for economical labor which others would not do. Native Americans were driven from their land so that settlers could inhabit those lands, and most minority groups were disadvantaged in one way or another. Mexicans lost their land holdings when the U.S. broke their treaty with Mexico, and Asians immigrated in order to build United States infrastructure such as the railroads. The U.S. economy has historically relied on cheap labor forces provided for by immigrant labor.